Hey, distinguished guests, HKU affiliates and students, thank you for joining us. You may have just missed our school's first Christmas party for staff members held earlier this afternoon, but don't worry. You're actually attending a party celebrating the visit of Professor William Fisher to our law school. I apologize. We don't actually have a Christmas tree here in this conference room. But I'm sure you can feel the atmosphere of this venue is filled with joy and lively thoughts. We are incredibly honored and privileged to have Professor Fisher deliver a public lecture on intellectual property and public health. Professor Fisher is a towering figure in the realm of intellectual property academia. As one of the original thinkers and scholars in the field, he has significantly influenced intellectual property theory and policy. Back in the 1980s, when most IP scholars focused on doctrinal issues, he shifted the direction of IP scholarship by publishing his groundbreaking article, Reconstructing the Fair Use Doctrine in Harvard Law Review. In that work, he pioneered the economic analysis of intellectual property law and offered a cultural theory of intellectual property law as well. His essay entitled Theories of Intellectual Property is among the most cited papers on IP theory and policy. Meanwhile, Professor Fisher has actively engaged himself in applying IP theory and policy to address real-world issues, particularly in regard to how IP can contribute to a good life and a good society. And for example, in his book, Promises to Keep, Technology, Law, and the Future of Entertainment, he presented a novel approach to address the crisis in the entertainment industry caused by digital technology. Indeed, music and films are a very important part of good life. And health is another vital aspect of good life. In today's public lecture, Professor Fisher will share with us his latest insights on how to utilize IP law to mitigate public health crises. Professor Fisher is also passionate about promoting intellectual property education through innovative methods. In 2013, he created the Copyright Act's online course, which now enrolls around 1,000 students annually. In 2021, he developed a similar online course on patent law and global public health in collaboration with the World Intellectual Property Organization. Both courses are freely available online and have attracted a diverse range of students from across the world. His creativity and generosity in offering such free and online courses frequently reminds me of what Confucius accomplished in ancient China. As you may know, it is Confucius who ventured to open the first private school in ancient China, ending the state monopoly in education and making education accessible to people from all walks of life. Please join me in welcoming Professor Fisher to deliver the public lecture.
Thank you very much, Haochen. It's a pleasure to be here. I was last here approximately 6 years ago, and since then, the world has changed. We've gone through the devastating crisis of the pandemic, and many aspects of government and society have been altered by it. But upon arriving here, I was very pleased to find that Haochen has not lost his gift for being a gracious host. So thank you for bringing me back. So what I will try to do in my time here is identify First, the essential features of what I'm going to describe as the global health crisis, and then suggest a set of solutions. Solutions in the sense of modifications or applications of the legal system that would mitigate, not eliminate, but mitigate important features of this crisis. I'll try to leave time at the end for questions so that we can have a conversation about some of these difficult issues. The global health crisis, as I'm going to define it, has two dimensions. The first is that the threats to human health posed by many diseases are currently increasing. Some of these threats are well known, others are not. The best known is, of course, the pandemic, which, as of today, has killed approximately 7 million people worldwide and infected about 700 million people. That's about 10% of the world's population. Although it's the most prominent of the pandemics, it's not the only one. Indeed, compared to some of the other pandemics in human history, it's relatively small. Compared, for example, to the Black Death that killed 200 million people, roughly 1/3 of the population of Europe. Nor will it be the last. So already lurking in sub-Saharan and East Africa are several other filoviruses that may be as devastating or more devastating than COVID. Ebola is the best known of these, but there are more. Putting aside global pandemics of that sort and turning instead to chronic or endemic diseases, currently, the most devastating in the world is tuberculosis. For a long time, meaning since approximately 1980, the total burdens associated with tuberculosis in the world have been going down, but very recently, they have ceased to decline and indeed have gone back up, both total deaths and deaths per 100,000. Most serious of all is the rise throughout every major region in the world of multiple disease-resistant tuberculosis, which, as its name suggests, is much more difficult to eradicate than the usual form. Much the same is true of malaria. Malaria peaked at approximately 2000 and then declined in deaths and prevalence worldwide until the last 2 years, where once again, it has rebounded. For a long time, malaria has been most devastating among children, and that remains true today. Most of these deaths are children under the age of 5. Cancer. The top 2 lines in this graph are grim, but they actually are not the most worrisome. Top line is total cancer deaths. That's been rising fast. On the other hand, that can be attributed in significant part to the fact that the world's population is increasing. Somewhat more worrisome is age-standardized cancer deaths. It too is rising. But most worrisome of all is the age-standardized cancer death rate, which, as you can see, was falling for a long time, but no longer. Parkinson's disease. Currently, we don't understand where Parkinson's disease comes from, and there is no vaccine and no cure. Since 2016, between 1990 and 2016, the global prevalence of Parkinson's increased by 20%, as did the number of deaths. Parkinson's currently kills about 200,000 people a year, and we have no way to stop it. Diabetes is rising at a distressingly rapid rate. We currently spend globally a little over $1 trillion a year dealing with diabetes, and that number will continue to go up. So that is a brief identification of some of the most serious of the threats we face. Now, I hasten to add, all is not doom and gloom. There are diseases that in categories in which we are continuing to make significant progress. Perhaps the most important is AIDS, which, for reasons I'll explore later in this lecture, was curbed starting in approximately 2007. And so global deaths from AIDS have been declining. They're not going away. It remains a chronic disease, but it is not as horrific a pandemic as we once feared. Cardiovascular disease currently kills more people in the world than anything else. And fortunately, as you can see, its prevalence is going down, not up. Respiratory infections also are declining, most importantly among children. And finally, in the field of cancer, there are some cancers in which we're making good progress. They include stomach cancer, lung cancer. And here, at last, is a theme I'll return to later in the lecture. The gray zone at the bottom of this chart is deaths associated with COVID. That's distressing, but the blue zone represents deaths that were avoided through the administration globally of vaccines. This is a rather remarkable success story in our capacity to develop and distribute a technology that could slow, although not eliminate, a pandemic. Okay, so putting these various trends together to review, there are a distressingly large number of diseases in the world that once seemed under control, but are no longer under control, that are getting worse, and we face the likelihood of pandemics, at least as serious as COVID going forward. The second of the two dimensions of the global health crisis is inequality. The disease burdens borne by low and middle income countries currently exceed the burdens borne by upper income countries. And the threats on the horizon may increase that inequality. The inequality is most severe with respect to infectious diseases. So if we look at the footprint of tuberculosis, as you can see, it's very heavily concentrated in sub-Saharan Africa, as is malaria, as is HIV/AIDS. Respiratory infections are not quite so concentrated, but again, they disproportionately affect the global south. When we turn from infectious and contagious diseases to non-communicable diseases, the picture gets more complicated. So cardiovascular diseases, which I indicated earlier is the biggest killer, are disproportionately concentrated in poor countries, but this time includes much of Asia, not just Africa and Latin America. Cancer is very spotty in its global footprint, and that's partly because the different cancers have radically different impacts. So this is pancreatic cancer, which disproportionately affects developed countries. This is lung cancer, which is especially severe, as you can see in China. Colon cancer, stomach, breast, prostate. So when you put all those together, you get a very complicated footprint. Also complicated and puzzling is the current impact of Parkinson's disease, which as I indicated earlier, we don't understand. One of the things we don't understand about it is why it seems not to have affected most countries in Latin America, whereas it is concentrated harshly in Africa and North America. Diabetes, commonly thought to be concentrated because of diet in developed countries. From the standpoint of mortality, that's not true. It disproportionately affects the poor. So when you put all these things together, you get a grim global map. This is life expectancy at birth using the most recent data from the World Health Organization. As you can see, it ranges from 50 in the Central African Republic to 84 in Japan. That's a huge disparity. Even more revealing and troubling is if we complicate life expectancy with the more inclusive metric known as healthy life expectancy, or Hale. This is life expectancy adjusted downward to take into account periods of time in which people live with illnesses or disabilities that reduce the quality of their life. So here you can see the spectrum is from 44 in several countries in sub-Saharan Africa to 74 in Japan. One of the striking things about this diagram, in addition to the inequality it reveals, is that healthy life expectancy in China is currently higher than in the United States. Okay, so that's the crisis. The reason why this is of interest, should be of interest to lawyers, is that vaccines and medicines could go far toward addressing both dimensions of this crisis. And for reasonably obvious reasons, the legal system is especially important in incentivizing the development of vaccines and medicines and distributing them. So we'll pause on the intermediate proposition. Why should we put so much weight on vaccines and medicines? Well, here's a historical case that suggests their potential importance. We go back to the United States and look at it historically. In 1900, the death rate from infectious diseases in the United States was approximately the same as in Zimbabwe today. Over the course of 120 years, it dropped dramatically for three reasons, or because of three forces that overlapped in time. The first is public health initiatives, improvements in the quality of the food, water, sanitation systems, and personal hygiene. That doesn't have much to do with the legal system. It's the second and third of the forces that do. So the second force is vaccines, introduced in the 1930s, big waves in the 1940s to 1980s. These are the major vaccines that were developed and distributed during that period. And they had a dramatic effect in reducing the incidence of infectious diseases. And finally, medicines, of which the most important were antibiotics. So these are the rates of decline associated with the three phases. As you can see, vaccines and medicines, even more than public health initiatives, resulted in a very dramatic reduction in the incidence of infectious diseases in the United States, and could contribute to an equally dramatic reduction in the footprint of diseases in developing countries. Unfortunately, the potential of vaccines and medicines is currently limited by three factors. The first is that incentives shaped by the legal system to develop appropriate vaccines and medicines are inadequate. So these are the traditional vaccines I mentioned a bit ago. They were all developed in order to address diseases that were common in rich countries. They now have been made available globally reasonably widely. The one significant exception here is rotavirus vaccine. The trouble is that the set of diseases that these vaccines address does not exhaust the set that afflicts poor countries. These are the diseases that afflict poor countries. And of that set, only these have vaccines. And the dotted lines, malaria and dengue, have vaccines that are highly imperfect. So the central point is that we have not yet structured the legal system so as to provide appropriate incentives for the development of the vaccines and medicines necessary to address the diseases common in the global south. That's the first of the three factors. Second, The drugs that do exist are often not affordable in low and middle income countries. There are many examples here. I'll give you just two. These are the current incidence rates of disease-resistant tuberculosis. As you can see, it's increasingly severe, especially in cases involving repeat infections. Now, disease-resistant tuberculosis can be cured, but it requires a long, as it turns out, very expensive regimen of drugs. So this diagram charts using logarithmic scales, GDP per capita along the bottom, so poor countries on the left, rich countries are on the right, and the cost of a course of treatment for disease-resistant tuberculosis on the vertical axis. So bearing in mind the logarithmic scale here, you can see that the cost varies quite widely by country, but it's typically somewhere between $1,000 and $20,000, which puts it well out of the reach of most residents of poor countries. Here's a more recent example. This is the footprint of sickle cell anemia, which is caused by the overlap of a mother and father's a genetic mutation carried by both mother and father. For complicated reasons, it's that those mutations are disproportionately concentrated in Central Africa. Last week, the first major therapy founded upon gene editing was approved by the FDA in the United States. It targets and has proven to be very effective in curing sickle cell anemia. But as you can see, the price at which it is currently offered, there are two of them, are either $3 or $2 million. Unsurprisingly, the companies that have developed the two therapies are concentrating on the United States, Britain, France, Germany, and Saudi Arabia, countries where there are significant populations who are able to afford that amount of money, but where there live only 2% of the global sickle cell population. Radical mismatch of an available medicine and the set of people who need it. Okay, that's the second of the three limiting forces. Here's the third. Many of the drugs currently distributed in both upper income countries and lower middle income countries are substandard or falsified. Now, in truth, when I began this project several years ago, I was unaware of this problem and only became aware of it because of repeated experiences when working with governments in Africa. And the pattern that gradually came to light is deeply distressing. So a recent report by the World Health Organization estimated that approximately 10% of the pharmaceutical products in developing countries are substandard or falsified. The sets of drugs where the problem is most severe are antimalarials and antibiotics. And the result is avoidable deaths of approximately 120,000 per year from malaria and 100,000 per year from pneumonia. Those are aggregate statistics, and I'll show you a few more detailed examples. This is East Africa, and these are the number of deaths, approximately, of children under the age of 5 each year because of substandard antimalarials. That's 74,000 people in Nigeria alone. These are data from Latin America, which indicate the kinds of diseases for which substandard and falsified drugs have been discovered. The top of the list here are anti-infective medicines. But this is especially concerning from the standpoint of population control. Contraceptives are routinely falsified in Latin America, as they are now increasingly in sub-Saharan Africa. Okay, so to sum up this portion of the lecture, there is a severe global health crisis. We could collectively deploy vaccines and medicines to mitigate it. We did deploy vaccines and medicines to significantly reduce disease burdens in the developed world and we could do the same in the developing world, why don't we? And these are the three reasons. First, the incentive systems, largely determined by patent law and other dimensions of intellectual property, that create carrots for the development of new drugs, are not well designed to induce the creation of the drugs we desperately need. Number two, existing drugs are often not affordable in the countries where they are most needed. And finally, many of the drugs currently distributed, especially but not exclusively in poor countries, are substandard or falsified. So the argument up to this point has been grim. We now hope to change the tenor by turning to solutions. So what could we do? And more specifically, what could we do with the legal system to help alleviate this problem? So in a forthcoming book and in the course that Haochen kindly described in his introduction, I explore 15 legal strategies that could mitigate the crisis. I'm not going to try here to cover 15. I'm going to instead concentrate on 5 that are representative. If you want to talk about some of the others, I'd be happy to address them. So here's the first. We could deploy better systems for detecting and eliminating these substandard and falsified medicines. So here's an example. This is a project that I've been involved in for the last about 4 years. It's a collaboration among the following institutions. First, a group of scholars at Harvard known as Global Access in Action. My colleague Ruth Okedici and I lead this group. Next is a faith-based organization based in Kenya called Medicines for Essential Drugs and Supplies. It's one of the most reliable of the East African drug distribution systems. The ministries of health in participating countries, of which the principal countries right now are Namibia and Malawi. Innospecta, which is a manufacturer of devices, which I'm going to describe in a minute, based in Taiwan. The London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, Infectious Diseases Data Observatory, and last but not least, the World Health Organization. Okay, so here's the technology that this collaboration has developed. It has 4 features or components. The first is a near-infrared scanner, little device, this big, costs about $800. Next is a Motorola smartphone, cost about $150. Next is custom software developed by an organization called Global Good. It was funded by Bill Gates. And the next is a database, consists of a library of spectral profiles of authenticated medicines that was prepared by and maintained, updated regularly by Meds in Kenya. So here's how it works. An inspector goes to a pharmacy or a central distribution center with these devices in hand and selects at random a pill. Step 1 is to use the smartphone to pick from a menu the type of drug that the pill purports to be. Next, you use the camera in the smartphone to take a picture of the packaging of the drug, and that picture is dated and geotagged, and therefore becomes part of a record that's aggregated in a minute. Next step, you place the pill on the scan head of the near-infrared scanner. It's that tiny window up there. You press scan on the device, and you get an image. If the scan taken by the device matches the authenticated profile in the database, the scan comes up green, and it tells you it's legitimate. If it doesn't match, it tells you it's either substandard or falsified, and it shows up red. It takes about 3 seconds to generate this result. Each of these devices is capable of approximately 40,000 tests. Nobody knows because actually none of them is worn out. So it's a rapid mechanism for detecting falsified medicines. So what do you do with the information gathered thereby? Well, you generate a map, literally a map, showing the hotspots in the world where the falsified drugs are entering the distribution chains. And most importantly, you use the information to purge the system of falsified drugs and to share information with the health ministries in other countries so they can do the same. The advantages of the system are it's fast, it's inexpensive. You can train inspectors fairly quickly. This was a photograph of a training session we conducted in Namibia. It enables quick random tests of pharmacies and distributors. We did in rural pharmacies in Malawi and Namibia. As you can see, the pharmacists are a little nervous as the tests are being conducted on their counters. Each participating country in the network benefits from data gathered in other participating countries, and the data gathered thereby can be used to purge the system of bad drugs. Now, I offer this as an example. It's not the only mechanism for detecting and ridding the world of bad drugs. There are several other technologies that are available. None currently is as good as this system, but I'm sure we will be surpassed at some point in the future by other mechanisms. So my objective on this particular portion of the presentation is not to defend this particular technology. It's rather to show it as a strategy that could be employed more than it currently is to reduce the number of deaths associated with bad drugs. Recently, the World Health Organization has picked up this technology and is now using it to train pharmacists in schools of pharmacy in Africa. We're hoping that it will spread. Okay, that's the first of the 5. Number 2, we could collectively use more frequently a voluntary licensing system to make cheap drugs available in poor countries. This is something that's largely in the hands of the pharmaceutical firms, but not exclusively, the reasons I'll suggest in a minute, in their hands. It's best seen by way of example. So the biggest success story in the use of voluntary licensing involves HIV. As of 2006, there were approximately 40 million people in the world infected with HIV and 4 million new infections per year and 3 million deaths. This is a catastrophic state of affairs, worse by far than COVID. What made it possible to curb this pandemic was the development of antiretroviral drugs, of which the most effective was one developed by Gilead Sciences, starting in 2001. In the first 5 years of its availability, it was largely marketed, reasonably high prices in developed countries, but then a group within Gilead began a system to make it available cheaply in poor countries. Initially, they tried to do that by manufacturing and distributing the drug themselves, but it didn't work well. Instead, they shifted to a system of voluntary licensing, in which eventually these are the generic manufacturers that were given authority to make and distribute in specified geographic areas, amounting in the end to 137 countries, generic versions of the drugs. And the result is that the price of the drugs dropped precipitously between 2007 and 2014. At the same time, increased funding for the purchase and distribution of these drugs became available. And the combination of the dramatic reduction in the price of the drugs and the increased availability of money produced a huge surge in the number of patients who had access to the antiretroviral medicines. So as you can see, by 2016, 10 million people, primarily in Africa, were using the Gilead drugs. Other pharmaceutical firms followed suit. And so by 2021, the total number of people is now 28 million. The benefits of this program were enormous. So most recent estimates are it saved roughly 16 million lives, of which about 12 million were saved by the Gilead program alone. That's voluntary licensing. Now, it sounds simple as an approach. You just grant a license to a generic firm to manufacture and distribute the drug. But in practice, it's much harder, requires a lot more detail to make an effective voluntary licensing system. So somewhat more specifically, to engage in voluntary licensing, the producer of the drugs here issues a voluntary license to a limited set of generic manufacturers, gives them authority to sell both to government purchasers and private purchasers in poor countries, who release it to distributors, and then sell it to patients. The system works best with the following extra features. First, multi-party deals. An effective voluntary license is not just a license from a pharmaceutical firm to a generic manufacturer. It embraces several other players, including government purchasers, national or regional regulatory authorities, and funders. And if you can get them all together to collaborate, everything moves smoothly. If you leave one of them out of the story, the system stalls. Next, keep the number of licensees limited. Don't grant a general non-exclusive license. Instead, issue licenses to trusted generic manufacturers. What's the advantage of doing that? Well, you preserve the quality of the medicines being produced. You build long-term relationships with the generics, and you give them an incentive to respect the limitations on the fields of use, which in turn enables the pharmaceutical firm to preserve its lucrative markets in the rich countries and makes them willing to engage in this practice in the first place. Next, include local producers in the voluntary licensing system. Local producers meaning manufacturers located within the country where the drugs are going to be distributed, or when that's not possible, within the region where the drugs are going to be distributed. Local production typically requires that government purchasers engage in advanced marketing commitments ahead of time, and funders agree to the deal. But if you can get everybody lined up, you can and should produce the drugs in the countries where they're going to be consumed. Next, technology transfer. Increasingly now, it's not sufficient to just give permission to a generic firm to manufacture a patented drug. You have to actively transfer the technology that's crucial to their creation. This isn't a one-way street. Typically, generic manufacturers develop improvements. And so voluntary licensing contracts contain commonly grant-back provisions that enable the licensor to learn from the generics. Next, it's a good idea in these systems for the licensor to preserve a small footprint in the poor countries for branded products. Why? Because by keeping the price of the branded version low, you set a de facto ceiling on the prices of the generics. Next, you can rely on trademark law and trade secret protection to limit unauthorized entry, and don't need to rely on patents, which often take a long time to get. And finally, transparency. These contracts should be open to public view. So if you build a voluntary licensing system of this sort, you can follow the lead of the distribution of HIV drugs in sub-Saharan Africa and save a lot of lives. Third of the strategies that I'll describe here today can be summarized much more quickly. Items 6, 7, 8, and 9 on this list all involve what are known as TRIPS flexibilities. That term refers to opportunities left to developing countries to adjust their patent systems to increase access to medicines in their own jurisdictions without running afoul of the provisions of the TRIPS agreement that binds all member countries of the World Trade Organization. The best known, but as it turns out, least effective of the TRIPS flexibilities involves compulsory licensing, the imposition by the government of a developing country of a regime forcing manufacturers to license at low prices their technologies locally. The reason why compulsory licenses are less effective than appears is because they do not carry with them duties to transfer technologies. And as the technologies underlying drugs get more complicated, monoclonal antibodies, mRNA vaccines, gene editing sequences, technology transfer is essential, and compulsory licenses don't do it. So other TRIPS flexibilities have to be employed, and they include, one of the little known ones is the possibility of adjusting patent law in developing countries so as to limit the availability of injunctive relief. The fourth of the 5 strategies that I'll summarize here involves an adjustment of the laws not of developing countries, but of developed countries. So, as is now widely recognized, there are 3 biases in the patterns of incentives that currently operate in the pharmaceutical industry. Those 3 biases are against breakthrough drugs. We currently produce too many Me Too drugs, follow-on innovation, and too few genuine breakthroughs. Next, a bias against vaccines in favor of therapies, because vaccines are less profitable for several reasons. And finally, a bias against the drugs aimed at neglected infectious diseases. So we could adjust the legal system in developed countries to offset all 3 biases. How? Well, there are a bunch of levers that could be used for this purpose. One of them is duration. You could, without running afoul of the TRIPS agreement, add to the duration either of a patent or of the associated data exclusivity periods, say 3 years for a breakthrough drug or a vaccine or a drug aimed at neglected diseases. And then, of course, there are overlaps. So, for example, a breakthrough vaccine would get 6, and a breakthrough vaccine aimed at a neglected disease would get an extra 9. This would boost the incentives to create the kinds of drugs we need. Another example, claim construction, an important doctrine in patent law that used to give a boost to so-called pioneering drugs. A boost meaning the claims in a patent associated with a pioneering invention were construed more generously than the claims in a patent associated with a Me Too invention. That doctrine was largely abandoned in most countries in the mid-20th century. It can and should be revived. Similar adjustment of the doctrine of equivalence could be employed to augment incentives in those 3 zones, and finally, increasing the availability of injunctive relief for pharmaceutical products that fall within these zones. Okay, that's the 4th, and turn the last of the 5 examples. Up till now, all of the adjustments that I've described are practicable, both in the technical sense and in the political sense. It would not take much to adopt them. By contrast, this 5th approach, although in my view, the most attractive, is unlikely to happen. But I'll describe it as a kind of reform that, if we had the will and the political clout, would be optimal. So here's how it would work. In addition to the carrots of the patent system, we would have a stick. And the stick would look like this. Every pharmaceutical firm would be obliged, say, as a condition for permission to market drugs in major jurisdictions like the United States, to achieve each year a ratio, fraction, the numerator of which is the total number of disability-adjusted life years saved as a result of the distribution and consumption of the firm's products. And the denominator is a measure of the firm's size, presumptively its gross revenues. A regime of this sort would leave up to each pharmaceutical firm a choice of how best to achieve this ratio. There'd be a variety of ways in which a firm could do it. It could reduce the prices charged for its drugs in developing countries, thereby increasing the number of persons able to afford them and thereby augmenting the ratio. It could alter the formulations of drugs already in its portfolio so they could be distributed more easily in developing countries. Again, increasing the numerator of the fraction. It could increase its investment in research projects that promise to generate drugs with large health benefits, like an improved malaria vaccine. It could alter its business acquisition policies to acquire more startups that are focused on neglected diseases. It could collaborate with governments or NGOs to improve distribution systems, like purging substandard and falsified drugs. It could buy dollies, meaning buy elements of the numerator from firms better positioned to improve public health. And last but not least, it could reduce the prices of all of its projects, thereby lowering the denominator. The last of these strategies is the least likely to be adopted. 1 through 6 would all contribute to relief of the global health crisis. So the advantages of this approach are, first, it would simultaneously improve incentives and improve access. Next, in contrast to top-down regulatory systems, it would capitalize on the informational advantage of the firms. They know better than government regulators do what would be the most efficient way to improve global health. It would enable the firms to respond rapidly to technological advances, pandemics, and changes in the landscape of diseases, which government officials, generally speaking, do not do. And finally, it would foster public discourse concerning the health crisis as a whole by making highly visible a number, which is the marginal cost of saving a human life. It's not likely to happen, but it would be better than our current regimes. So those are the 5. I'm eager to hear your questions and comments.